Section 1. In this section, you will hear a conversation between two neighbors discussing a dispute regarding noise, parking rights, and shared access to a communal driveway. But first you have time to go through questions 1 to 5.
Look, before we get into another spiral of emails that sound more formal than either of us intend, I thought it'd be easier to just talk face to face. The thing is, the drilling at around 7 yesterday morning wasn't just loud, it actually shook the wall next to my study. I had a remote presentation for my team in Frankfurt and, well, it threw the whole thing off.
I get that it probably felt disruptive, but the contractor insisted the earlier they start, the quicker they finish. And I specifically asked them not to touch the supporting beams near your side until after 9. If they went out of order, that's on them, not me.
Except you hired them. And when I tried to reach you, your phone was on airplane mode. I know because your message said so. So I couldn't even get someone to pause the work.
That's because I was on a video call with my sister in Melbourne. If I don't put my phone on airplane mode, it keeps switching connections and the call drops. You know how inconsistent the signal is on this side of the house?
Still, it's the second time this week, and the parking situation isn't helping either. I came home last night and found your contractor's van blocking half the driveway again. My car scraped against the planter trying to squeeze through.
Now, the van situation is something I did address. He was supposed to park by the curb, not on the shared strip. If he moved it after, I can't control every minute of his choices. But I can talk to him again.
I'm not asking you to micromanage them. I'm asking for some predictable boundaries. The drilling, the early starts, the parking, it all adds up. I'm usually patient, but it's starting to feel like my schedule has to bend around your renovations.
Well, the renovations aren't optional. The inspector said the joists were compromised and water was seeping into the insulation. If I don't fix it now, it'll cost a fortune later, which indirectly affects property values, including yours.
I understand the necessity. I just wish the execution was a bit more considerate, or at least communicated in advance so I can plan around it.
Before you hear the rest of the audio, you have time to go through questions 6 to 10.
I get the urgency, but even urgent work doesn't need to feel unpredictable. Like last Thursday, your plumber rang my doorbell thinking my side of the basement was the access point. I didn't even know you were doing plumbing repairs.
That wasn't actually a repair. It was more of an investigation. The inspector said the moisture readings were unusually high on both our walls, so the plumber wanted to trace where the condensation originated. He thought the shared pipe junction was on your side.
Except it isn't. And because he couldn't find it, he wandered around my garden looking confused. I had to usher him back out because he kept saying the mapping diagram was outdated.
To be fair, those diagrams were drawn up 30 years ago. They're barely accurate anymore. And yes, I should have told you, but it was one of those things the plumber squeezed in between appointments. He called me 10 minutes before arriving.
That's exactly the kind of thing that's causing friction. Look, yesterday when I got home, there was a stack of timber planks leaning against my fence. The contractor said he placed them there because your side looked flatter, but that's not a reason to trespass.
I agree. That one's out of line. I'll tell them to store everything on the paved area only, and I'll mark it clearly so they don't improvise. They seem to like improvising a bit too much.
That would help. Also, if you know which days the loudest work is happening, just text me the night before. I can shift my calls to another room or even go to a cafe if needed. I'm not asking for a silence bubble, only for predictability.
All right, that's fair. And maybe I should ask the contractor for a day-by-day plan instead of vague, we'll see as we go updates. It'll help both of us.
Exactly. Communication avoids escalation. I don't want this to become some neighborly Cold War. We've always been on good terms.
Same here. Let's reset then. I'll keep you informed, rein in the contractors, and make sure the driveway stays clear.
That's all I'm asking for. Thanks.
Section 2. In this section, you will hear a monologue in which a social technology researcher discusses the unintended consequences of predictive behavior algorithms used in public service systems. But first, you have time to go through questions 1 to 5.
When people talk about predictive behavior algorithms in public services, they almost always start with efficiency, how the systems can allocate limited resources to where they are supposedly needed most. But the story becomes murkier when we look at how the predictions evolve over time. These are not static classifications, even though the people affected often feel as though they are. Instead, the algorithms update their models continuously, drawing on streams of data that most individuals never even realize count as behavioral indicators. Something as mundane as an irregular library book return pattern can, in certain municipalities, quietly feed into a broader model of civic punctuality. Now, the intention isn't surveillance for its own sake. Most departments using these systems claim they're trying to prevent small administrative issues from snowballing into major social costs. But I've observed, through fieldwork and interviews, that people who receive algorithm-triggered outreach often feel singled out in a way that doesn't align with their lived reality. One teenager, let's call her Lena, was flagged as potentially disengaging from school because she missed 2 days in a row, even though one absence was due to a mandatory dental procedure and the other because she attended a regional athletics trial. The system didn't consider the broader context. The troubling part is not simply that the algorithm misread her behavior. It's that the recommendation it produced, an automatic advisory email to her parents, implicitly framed Lena as falling behind, which caused tension at home. Her parents assumed the school had information they did not. In reality, the system was drawing inferences from incomplete data, despite disclaimers saying the classifications were merely probabilistic. But those disclaimers, as one administrator admitted to me, are seldom read, let alone understood. We also need to consider how these models behave across time. Slight irregularities build upon each other, and because the systems are designed to detect changes relative to a baseline, it becomes possible for a person to inadvertently drift into a higher risk category without any meaningful shift in behavior. A parent who pays a permit fee a few days late in January, then renews a parking pass just before the deadline in March, might find themselves categorized as increasingly non-compliant. The category sounds accusatory, despite relying on a fragile chain of associations. This isn't to say predictive systems have no place in public administration, but the assumption that more data automatically leads to better predictions simply hasn't held up. We're seeing patterns where the algorithm's confidence increases even while its accuracy stagnates. And when confidence outpaces accuracy, the people classified have little recourse because the systems operate quietly behind the scenes. In some districts, even the caseworkers don't fully understand how the risk scores are produced.
Before you hear the rest of the audio, you have time to go through questions 6 to 10.
What complicates matters even further is the feedback loop created when public workers rely on algorithmic assessments as a shortcut for initial triage. I spoke with the community liaison officer who admitted that when a case file arrived with a moderate risk label, he instinctively scanned for signs that might justify the classification rather than questioning the system's premise. He wasn't doing this out of laziness. He simply assumed that the model, built by data scientists far removed from frontline complexities, was operating on a logic more rigorous than his own intuition. But this assumption is precisely how bias gets amplified. Once a prediction enters the system, it influences the subsequent documentation. Officers may word their reports in ways that align with the algorithm's assessment, if only subconsciously. A slightly late tax submission becomes habitual delay, or a missed housing forms deadline gets rephrased as emerging compliance issues. The language then feeds back into the model during its next training cycle, reinforcing the very trends it predicted regardless of their grounding in reality. Administrators may believe the system is getting smarter when in fact it is becoming more self-referential. We must also talk about opacity. Many of these models use proprietary scoring methods protected by intellectual property regulations, meaning even the public agencies implementing them cannot fully audit their internal calculations. I encountered one district where staff received a risk score accompanied only by a brief explanation such as inferred disengagement, without any breakdown of which behaviors generated that inference. Caseworkers described the experience as being asked to interpret a horoscope written by a machine, specific enough to seem meaningful, yet too cryptic to verify. Moreover, individuals labeled by these systems often become aware of the classification only when they encounter unexpected administrative friction. A university applicant might discover their financial aid review is undergoing enhanced scrutiny without understanding that the trigger was an algorithm flagging a minor inconsistency in their household income declaration from years prior. The lack of transparency leads people to invent their own explanations, which can erode trust in public institutions. Despite these concerns, policymakers continue to expand predictive models into domains ranging from public health outreach to transportation enforcement. They argue that without such tools, the sheer volume of administrative tasks would overwhelm human staff. But efficiency cannot be the sole justification. Without transparency safeguards, contextual adjustments, and opportunities for contestation, predictive algorithms risk transforming public service systems into opaque decision engines that subtly reshape citizen behavior while claiming neutrality.
Section 3. In this section, you will hear a discussion between two postgraduate students about their joint research on microplastic trophic transfer in freshwater macroinvertebrate communities. Listen carefully and answer the questions, but first you have time to go through questions 1 to 5.
So, Daniel, have you finalized the sampling frame for the macroinvertebrate survey along the river transect?
Mostly. I propose stratified sampling across 3 microhabitats: riffles, pools, and emergent vegetation margins. That should capture heterogeneity in particle retention and feeding gilts.
Good. But remember the last study we reviewed? Its riffle samples had an unexpected bias towards shredders because the mesh size they used excluded smaller taxa. We should adopt a dual mesh approach, one at 500 micrometers for larger taxa and a 250 micrometer for finer detritivores.
I considered that. The trade-off is processing time. Extracting microplastics from a 250-micron sieve increases lab hours substantially. But methodologically, it's more defensible, especially since microfibers often adhere to smaller-bodied taxa.
Exactly. Also, regarding microplastic identification, do we rely solely on visual microscopy with Nile red staining or incorporate Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy for subset?
FTIR is ideal, but it's expensive and time-consuming. My plan is to screen all particles with Nile red and then run FTIR validation on a representative 20% subset stratified by size class. That gives us both throughput and chemical specificity.
That sounds statistically reasonable. Make sure the 20% subset is randomized within each size stratum. Otherwise, we risk confirmation bias toward visually obvious polymers like polyethylene fragments.
Agreed. Another concern is trophic position inference. Gut content analysis gives immediate ingestion evidence, but stable isotope mixing models provide temporal integration. Should we pair gut content with delta 13C and delta 15N?
We should. The isotopic approach lets us infer assimilation rather than mere ingestion. However, isotopic turnover rates vary across taxa, so we must calibrate turnover with lab-fed controls for the focal species. Otherwise, isotopic signals may misrepresent recent feeding events.
That's a fair point. I can set up a short-term feeding trial with Chironomidae and a caddisfly species to estimate half-lives. It will take extra time, but it will strengthen any claim about trophic transfer versus incidental ingestion.
Good. Include that in the timeline. Also, ensure we log environmental covariants like suspended particulate matter and dissolved organic carbon. They can confound correlations between microplastic loads and feeding gilts.
Before you hear the rest of the audio, you have time to go through questions 6 to 10.
Now, about statistical analysis, are we going to use generalized linear mixed models or structural equation modeling to link microplastic burden to trophic position?
I favor GLMMs because they handle hierarchical data well. Individual specimens nested within taxa, taxa nested within sites. We can include random intercepts for site and taxa, and fixed effects for particle concentration, SPM, and dissolved organic carbon.
DLMMs will work, but if we want to tease apart direct and indirect effects, say particulate matter influencing feeding behavior, which then affects microplastic ingestion, an SEM could be insightful. It's more demanding, but could articulate causal pathways.
True, but SEM requires larger sample sizes to be robust. Given our logistical constraints, a compromise might be to run GLMMs first, and if the dataset permits, follow up with a confirmatory SEM on a reduced variable set.
That's pragmatic. On sample size, what power threshold are we targeting? Many ecological studies suffer from low power and inflated type 2 error.
I ran a preliminary power analysis assuming a small to moderate effect size, Cohen's d around 0.4. To reach 80% power at alpha equals 0.05, we need roughly 120 individual gut samples per feeding gild across sites. It's feasible if we increase sampling frequency.
Okay. Make sure to document that assumption and consider effect size sensitivity in the supplement. Also, how will you handle microplastic count data, skewness, Poisson, or negative binomial distributions?
Initial exploratory plots show overdispersion, so negative binomial GLMMs are appropriate. For proportional data, like percent fibers versus fragments, we'll use beta regression after transformation.
Sounds rigorous. Finally, think about ethical sampling. We must minimize harm to protected taxa and obtain permits for destructive sampling. Also, coordinate with the local conservation authority to avoid sampling during sensitive life stages.
Yes, I'll draft the permit application and an ethical justification that emphasizes minimal sample sizes and non-lethal sampling where possible, such as using regurgitation induction for some taxa.
Excellent. Once you have the permit draft, we can refine the analysis plan and finalize the timeline.
Section 4. In this section, you will hear a lecture delivered by a professor on the topic of cognitive offloading and its implications for human memory systems. Listen carefully and answer the questions. But first you have time to go through questions 1 to 5.
Today's lecture focuses on cognitive offloading, a term describing how individuals transfer portions of mental processing onto external aids, such as digital devices, written reminders, or even environmental cues. The common assumption is that offloading inevitably weakens internal memory capacity. However, that inference is far too linear to capture the behavioral complexity observed in empirical studies. What we see instead is a dynamic negotiation between internal memory and external scaffolding, shaped by cognitive load, task relevance, and perceived risk of forgetting. For example, consider prospective memory tasks, like remembering to send an email at a later time. Experiments show that people often set digital reminders even when the task is trivial enough to be remembered unaided. This is not necessarily a sign of memory failure, but may represent a metacognitive efficiency strategy, particularly when individuals anticipate switching between multiple high-demand tasks. In these situations, offloading serves as a form of cognitive insurance, freeing attentional resources for activities deemed more valuable. Interestingly, over-reliance on offloading does not always translate into diminished recall. Some studies demonstrate a compensatory mechanism where individuals, knowing that certain information is externally stored, encode remaining information more deeply. Yet, this is inconsistent and depends heavily on environmental stability. When external aids fail, say a device battery dies, participants who habitually offload show a measurable performance drop, suggesting that offloading creates vulnerability when contingencies shift unexpectedly. Another nuance relates to agency and intentionality. When people voluntarily choose to offload, they tend to preserve better metacognitive insight than when offloading is imposed. Autonomy appears to moderate how offloading interacts with self-regulated learning. Moreover, cultural norms around technological dependency influence how acceptable offloading is perceived to be, thus shaping individual strategies. In environments where digital reliance is stigmatized, participants may underutilize offloading despite potential performance benefits. Overall, cognitive offloading is not a simple trade-off, but a multi-layered adaptive behavior influenced by context, expectations, and resource constraints.
Before you hear the rest of the audio, you have time to go through questions 6 to 10.
Let's turn now to the neural mechanisms associated with cognitive offloading. Neuroimaging research reveals that reliance on external memory aids modulates activation patterns across prefrontal and parietal networks. For instance, when individuals expect to store information externally, the lateral prefrontal cortex exhibits reduced recruitment during encoding phases, a phenomenon sometimes mistaken for cognitive laziness. Yet reduced activation does not indicate disengagement. Rather, it reflects a shift toward resource allocation strategies tuned to expected task demands. At the same time, anticipatory offloading increases activity in regions associated with perspective planning, such as the rostral prefrontal cortex. This suggests that offloading is not purely reactive. It is a forward-looking behavior requiring metacognitive foresight. The brain appears to simulate future bottlenecks and distribute processing responsibilities accordingly. This computational redistribution becomes especially pronounced in multitasking contexts, where individuals leverage external tools to manage competing cognitive priorities. Another intriguing aspect is the role of uncertainty. When task demands are unpredictable, individuals often engage in what researchers call precautionary encoding, strengthening internal memory traces despite planning to offload. This dual coding strategy resembles redundancy in engineering systems. It may be inefficient, but provides resilience against failure. However, when people are overly confident in external infrastructure, precautionary encoding diminishes, amplifying the risks associated with device malfunction or context shifts. Finally, cross-cultural imaging studies reveal substantial variability in neural responses to offloading. Participants from cultures with strong technological integration show attenuated conflict signals in the anterior cingulate cortex when deciding whether to offload, whereas individuals from low-tech environments recruit error monitoring circuits more strongly, as if offloading represents a potential risk. These findings underscore that cognitive offloading is simultaneously neurobiological, psychological, and sociocultural, challenging simplistic narratives about technology eroding memory. Instead, it reveals a behavioral spectrum shaped by expectations, norms, and adaptive neural recalibration.